Welcome to Psych for Psychology, a Nystrom and Associates podcast. Our host, Brett Cushing, is a licensed marriage and family therapist at Nystrom. Each week, he talks about all things mental health and therapy with guests, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, your host, Brett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Psych for Psychology. We are delighted to have you here with us, and we have Isaac Hatch-Gillette, a up-and-coming mental health hipster, as we've been talking about earlier.
It's because he has a mustache.
He has a mustache.
We were talking about the mustache, and
it's impressive.
Yeah, it's brand new.
It's impressive. Well, if anybody has seen and knows Tom Selleck, it's. Well, not like that, but it's close. It's getting there. And so this is our first mental health hipster, and we're excited.
We're excited to have him in the studio today.
And I'm flattered. We are delighted to have you here because you're going to be talking about group therapy. And we haven't really discussed this on the podcast ever.
No.
And so you are also going to be starting a group here with Nystrom and Associates. You're going to be starting a group at your clinic in Apple Valley.
Correct.
We'll talk more about that, at the end, so people can join that group if they want. But tell us maybe to begin with, why group therapy?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think if you're working with individuals, people are going to come in and they have kind of their own personal concerns, and then they might have interpersonal concerns, but they're always limited from their perspective. And so it can be hard for people to actually identify and gain insight as to maybe some of the things that are a bit more maladaptive or troublesome in the way they engage with others. And so group, in the same way of kind of couples counseling, you need both sides of the coin. Group is pulling people into a room and developing relationships with strangers. And ideally, some of these more troublesome behaviors that you might have in relationships kind of come to the forefront, and we can address them. And then it's a lot of building distress tolerance, communication skills, practicing being authentic.
I have an example. Because I was thinking about how to explain this, right? Because individual therapy, obviously, you go in, you talk to one-on-one on a professional. But then I was thinking about, okay, have you ever been in a group setting, like a staff meeting or some sort of get together, and there's just one person in the group that rubs you the wrong way,
totally.
Or and you just don't really put a name to it. You're just kind of bothered. So the way I was thinking about group therapy is when that happens in a group therapy setting, that's something you would pay attention to. And it's something you might have a chance to work through, such as what is it about this person that is it's just bugging me, right? And it could have to do with your past. It could have to do with who knows what. But it's you wouldn't necessarily be able to flush that out one-on-one with your therapist, right? Because those people or situations aren't coming to the surface.
So I think that's a really good point, and it really highlights how group therapy can be an extra hurdle for people because it feels safer. For a lot of people, it doesn't feel safe going to therapy just with a therapist,
right?
Who's a stranger. Now I got a group of strangers, and my mom told me not to talk to strangers. So this is really hard for me.
Yeah.
And I see the benefit.
Yep.
Because we kind of are pushing ourselves to move towards something that we might find that we might find ourselves averse to. So why in the world do I want to do?
Oh, sure. What's in it for me? Yeah.
Right.
I might get
why do I
it
want
works,
to do this?
Yeah, true.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable. I think it's uncomfortable. I think the thing is, anytime something maybe feels uncomfortable for you, there's a chance there might be something there to work on. And so attending to that and knowing all right, if this feels like a hurdle, it's probably something I need to jump over. And your therapist, while they might challenge you, they're not going to be confrontational. There's not going to be a big conflict in the office on one-on-one. And I think in group therapy, if there doesn't get to be a point where there's conflict, the group probably isn't making progress because you really want people to bring everything to the surface. And in a room that's, really diverse, there's a good chance people are going to butt heads. And that's kind of where the growth and learning can happen.
For sure. I also was thinking about how the social support aspect, because you were, Brett, raising a really good point. Like, why do it? Like, individual therapy is effective, so why kind of make the leap? So, I think it's really easy, especially nowadays more than ever, to be isolated socially. And so it's not like it's not like the point of the group is to socialize or to like make new friends necessarily, but to connect with other human beings on a level that you may not have connected with other human beings in a while, right? Like it used to be, people, I think when they had bigger families or maybe churches or, like people had their communities, and yeah, they still do. But where are you going to like have this deeper conversation with a group, really?
Well,
maybe 12-step.
The word you said, I think that's powerful and really connects is the word connect. There is a connection that can happen. And as human beings, we are really oriented to connect. We need to connect. It's part of what it is to be human. And yet, I think you and I talked about this one other time, to be connected relationally with people, that takes energy. It takes very little energy to just isolate and stay at home and not do anything.
Yep.
To even get out and try to connect with people, there's a startup, if you will, of energy that I don't feel I have sometimes. And I think like younger adults today are very averse to this because, and we could talk about social media sometime. That would be really a good topic.
Yeah, it would.
But in their world of doing social media type things, they have so much social anxiety because if I post just the wrong thing, I could lose my entire friend group, support group. I could get ghosted by just writing the wrong thing. And then like I've lost everybody. Now I got to go to group and that can cause a lot of anxiety. Yet group is incredibly powerful. It's so helpful. And what other benefits are there, do you guys think, about going to group?
Another thing that comes to mind is like the sense that it's a very kind of concrete way to normalize having mental health concerns, right? So you can be in the therapy office one-on-one and they'll say, oh, I know so many people that have this concern, like you're not alone in this, but to hop into that room and see other people actually like struggling and sharing in that, I think can be pretty powerful. And then within that, starting to recognize, okay, I can like actually support these people. I know a lot of the answers. And then the trouble is like seeing how it can help me. But if maybe I see someone else start doing it, there's some of that like modeling there. So there's a lot of opportunity to just kind of collaborate, support each other, build some like sense of esteem.
Yep. Actually, I think you're touching on something which is, I don't know about the two of you, but I learn really well through the use of like stories and examples. So if I'm like in therapy, sometimes I'll use self-disclosure, which is basically like sharing something about myself with my client in order to make a point or, there's usually a purpose to it that's very pointed. So in group, I could see how listening to others' stories and examples of like how they got through a situation or how they overcame a certain challenge, even if you're just listening and you're not even necessarily the one sharing, like that example and that story is going to stick with you more so than if someone just said like, well, use coping skills or do your deep breathing. Like it's just, it makes it more memorable. I think just the way our brains work in a way.
Yeah, I think you both bring up excellent points that there's the connection, there's the normalization. And I think with that comes a sense of validation that I'm not alone. For me, in the groups that I lead with DBT, for instance, we have a group of people that are strangers initially. And as they go through the group, that source of people in the group it's normalizing, hey, I'm not alone. There's a connection. Hey, you get me. And that is validating for people. And those people become indispensable then because this is the place where I'm really understood. I'm really accepted. My family doesn't get me because they may not understand fully what it means that I'm wired this way. And yet these people do.
Exactly.
Yeah, acceptance, that stands out. Like thinking of if conflict arises in the room, all right, we're not going to just jump ship or abandon each other. We're actually going to sit and like go deeper on it with one another. Like maybe I'm overly sensitive and I got hurt by maybe something that wasn't necessarily hurtful, or maybe I am just actively hurting people as kind of like a guardrail, right? So, but can go a lot of different directions. But yeah, sitting in there and just accepting the fact that we all have our struggles and then working through it as a team, so to speak.
Yep. I wanted to look too, because I was like, okay, so from a research perspective, is group therapy effective, right? So this is from, there's a textbook about group therapy by Irving Yalom, who's kind of definitely a big name in psychotherapy. He wrote, I think, The Gift of Therapy is one of his more well-known books, and then he wrote this textbook about groups. So I was digging through there. I was kind of like, all right, what's this all about? So there were 32 studies comparing the effectiveness of group therapy to individual therapy. So of the 32 studies, 25% of them suggested group therapy was more effective than individual therapy. So that was about a quarter of the studies. The other 75% of those studies, they showed that group therapy was as effective as individual therapy. So there were no actual, in these 32 studies, there were no studies that actually found individual therapy to be more effective necessarily. So I was blown away by that. I was kind of thinking, maybe 50-50, but I mean, basically, there are, I think it's a big benefit. So, yeah.
That reminds me of a study I'd come across about a year ago. I can't remember where. I apologize.
Sure.
Yet it was powerful, and it really stuck with me. And it showed how people who have addiction problems, they started with the premise that people, when they have an issue where they go to the hospital, they get pumped with all sorts of drugs, but they leave and they're not addicted to it. Why is that? And their hypothesis was that because they go back from the hospital to their community and they had a sense of community. So what they did is, I think this was done in Spain and in Canada, 2 different studies, same conclusion. They took rats and they had a bottle of water and they had a bottle of some water laced with drugs. And, well, they always went to the bottle laced with drugs, just these 2 rats or mice. But then they threw in a larger cage with more mice or rats, whatever it was. And then they had all sorts of stimulation in there that they could stimulate themselves with. And they never went to the bottle laced with drugs.
When they were with a group, or when they had
right.
connection.
So the point is they had connection. They had community, which really, their point was what's crucial in overcoming an addiction is that sense of connection and community with other people, which underscores what you were just reading too.
Right, exactly.
So groups are super powerful, and it can kind of feel like, stranger danger to begin with, and yet it can become not only a very safe place for us, maybe even the safest place for some people, it's a place of genuine transformation for people.
Yeah.
I think one other piece that is, I don't want to take us too far off in the weeds here, but this stood out to me when I was reading the textbook about group therapy, is another benefit of group therapy is you might have an option or a chance to process patterns of communication from your family of origin. So your family that you grew up in. So I'm all over that, right? As a marriage and family therapist, I was like, ooh, what is this all about? So if you think about how we learn to do relationships, we learn it in our primary family of origin, right? Now, that can mean a lot of different things, but let's say I have this way that I've learned to interact with the world and with people, and now I'm in a group setting with group therapy, and now I'm going to start to re-experience some of those patterns, and it doesn't mean they're working for me, right? It doesn't mean they're bad either. But I think if there's anything that I need to shift and change, a group is kind of like a live, sort of, I guess, playground, to kind of work that out. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think he uses the phrase recapitulate the family dynamic.
There it is.
He says that so many times.
Recapitulate the family dynamic.
It's a great word. Recapitulate.
Recapitulate meaning redo?
I think reform.
Reform, rehash.
Like that, but
the family dynamic. Right. Because a good example is, and they've studied kind of communication patterns of families with addiction, and one of them, there's these 8 unspoken rules of family systems, and I'm not going to remember all of them, but one of them is what's called a no talk rule, where you don't acknowledge or verbalize like problems. Like it's that elephant in the room concept, right? So I think a lot of times we grow up in this family, we don't talk about things openly. Now I'm in a group and we're like actually potentially going to address elephants in the room, so to speak, like tensions or conflicts or whatever. So that's one example of how you might be able to overcome the urge to just clam up when there's conflict or clam up when there's
and then to have a person maybe coming from an opposite sort of system in there where we address everything. And every mountain is made out of a molehill, and having those two kind of opposite family dynamics in perspective can really be it can pull a lot of things to the surface for sure.
Right, because if you think about it, you grew up, you didn't really know what was going on. Kind of like a fish doesn't perceive the water that it's swimming in. We don't really know what we don't know. So then you get in a group and all of a sudden you're having a chance to redo things. I do think it proves that we all have this tendency to like, because this is the way things have always been, there's no other way it could be, right? And so in group, I think you could experience like, oh, I can have a tough conversation and have people still like me. Or like, I can have a conversation with people that aren't going to judge me and leave me and yell at me.
It's kind of like exposure therapy.
There you go.
For people who have like maybe a fear of flying, we try to do little bits of prolonged exposure, maybe go to the airport. Then the next time you go into a plane, then you go and sit down in the plane. And so you have this gradual exposure. And notice again, like we were talking about at the beginning with group, we have this aversion to it because it's easier to isolate. It feels safer. And so there's all this startup to kind of get into group, and yet it really is an opportunity to recalibrate and realize, so wow, how I've been living my entire life. It's not that it's all bad, but wow, these aspects aren't as effective. And having other people around normalizes that, can validate and say, hey, I learned this too. And I'm maybe a little further along in my journey. And that helps people recalibrate, reorient themselves. And that's where change can begin.
Yeah, I think that point of like figuring something new out, it's, again, like I think the group is really powerful for teasing out the blind spots that are typically there in individual therapy, right? So, like if I have one half of a couple, well, it's likely we're talking mostly about the partner. Like, when are they going to do something different? What are they going to change? And that's why couples therapy is maybe more effective in that regard. But then someone else maybe just working on their kind of individual issues, they're talking about everyone else in their circle, and I don't know these people at all. But they're expressly saying, like, this person is causing me problems without acknowledging, like, okay, but where am I showing up in this? Like, how do I actually present in social settings?
Yes. Right? I have another example of that, actually, that from that book, the textbook about group therapy. It's very readable. I mean, I was like, I can't believe I'm just straight up reading a textbook right now.
Textbook,
it's actually not
readable.
That's not super jargony. It's a pretty.
I know.
It's an oxymoron in my mind. Textbook and readable.
Readable textbook. Exactly. Yeah. I know. I was surprised too, but I think that's a testament to Irving Yalom. He's very good at making it kind of readable, I guess. But so an example that he shared about another reason why group, right? Was he gave an example of a man who was going to the group, and he just had a hard time making and keeping friendships. And it was kind of like he wasn't really able to figure out why, like what was he doing that was kind of either pushing people away or what was going on. And at some point during the group, he had been sharing something about himself and kind of sharing on a personal level. And then, a little while later started talking about, kind of went into this really informational like mode and like this monologue of, facts and figures and whatever. And one of the group members, a woman in the group, said, when you were sharing personally about yourself, I wanted to draw closer to you, like I was engaged and I was interested. She said, when you went into kind of your facts and figures robotic monologue, you lost me. And so what he was able to take away from it, even though it was probably hard to hear, was being aware of how am I coming across to fellow human beings, right, in conversation, and like that was turning people off. Like that was, people were kind of like, oh boy, avoid this guy. But if he knew that, and then he can change that. So I think that's another example of in individual therapy. I don't know that the therapist would know to like call that out or that that would even come up. Right. Right.
And for the therapist, it might not even be something the therapist realizes. Exactly. And that was the point I wanted to make too, is that sometimes other people in a group give feedback and have observations that as a therapist, when I'm running a group, I hear somebody say something, give some feedback, and I'm like, wow, that is fantastic. Yes. And I'll tell them that is such great insight. Yep. And other people resonate with it. It's so profound. So many hands makes light work, while many minds giving input makes change more likely to happen.
Yep.
And then there's also, I think there's a lot of interesting things that come out of, there starts to be some power struggles, and then people work through that dynamic and level the playing field. You know, he talks about these stages, and that's like one of them. And then people kind of develop a closeness as they've worked through all the tough emotions. Yep. And then the process kind of starts over, and they keep like cycling through like conflict, settle, we're closer, conflict, settle, we're closer. Like, and the process is, you know, he calls it very here and now therapy, where you're basically, every time someone states an emotion, you're gathering the reaction of the room, and then the reaction to the reaction. You kind of dive further and further. And, you know, this is his model. There's obviously lots of other ones. And I think maybe that's something that gets missed or misunderstood about a lot of groups, is there's like the pop culture kind of idea where a lot of times it is just turn-based, no crosstalk. Right.
Like I have my turn to share and then I'm
quiet. Right. Very much like
school.
Very much like the AA model.
Right.
Yep.
Or that, you know, definitely there's some groups that are very like psychoeducational, which has its purpose. But I think a group like this is maybe less so known about. So.
Right. I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that what we're talking about, a true like psychotherapy group, is not a class, right? It's not a classroom situation. It's not a teach, you know, where you're just listening to a lecture. It's also not, for those of you familiar with 12-step programs, the anonymous, you know, groups, you know, usually those are highly, highly structured meetings where you don't really speak unless it's sharing time and you're kind of even maybe timed on your talk. And you're not supposed to interject or like give feedback or anything. So this is not that, right? This would be a lot more interactional. And then the role of the group leaders to kind of watch all what's going on.
Right.
Yeah. And the one other example in the book too that was so fun was you were talking about how there might be power struggles in the group, Isaac. And like, I think the group leader starts to represent almost like a parent figure. So kind of back to interacting with your family of origin, like rehashing that past. So there can be sometimes a group member who starts to feel like the group leader never calls on me, you know? I'm the other group members, you know, he mentioned an example of a woman who came back from a vacation and noticed no one even acknowledged that I was gone from my vacation. And yet when Susie came back from her vacation, everyone was like, oh, tell us all about your trip. You know, so it was really pointing to, she had this deep insecurity and need for like feeling seen and feeling acknowledged. And that was able to be kind of processed in the group too.
The notion of attention that brings something up, you know, you are the entirety of your therapist's attention in individual sessions, right?
Yes.
So maybe, you know, there's that aspect of like, I want to be the main focus, but then also like, oh, am I actually like getting my money's worth? Can this person really do therapy for 8 people at once?
Totally.
And, so that I could see that being like a point of concern, but to all of our points, you know, this is why you actually are getting your money's worth in that sort of setting. There's a lot of benefits.
Yeah, I think we think about value, and I think it is invaluable for someone to conclude, I'm not alone.
Yes.
And that's, I think, inherent in what you were just saying, Christa, that you can go to a group and you have this experience at work, or you have this experience in your relationship where you're not heard, and you share that, and other people say, that happened to me too. And there's this validation of the feelings and experiences that other people had. Whereas prior to that, going to group, they just feel alone. They feel misunderstood. And again, it just underscores how valuable this is when we're thinking about, am I going to get my money's worth out of it? I think it's invaluable because of the connection and the validation. Mm-hmm. One thing I want to bring up, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the aspect of vulnerability, because there is this sense of being seen. And people might feel like, if I go, everyone's going to see things I don't even want to look at. Mm-hmm. Right. And how would you speak to that, Isaac?
Well, I mean, if you're going to even individual therapy, you've kind of already accepted that term. I think that's part of the challenge. Again, thinking about that discomfort, that probably means there's something there to work on. Mm-hmm. If we think of like the mind as kind of habits, thoughts, right? They're habitual. The notion of how we think other people think about us is often kind of how we hold ourselves to some degree as well. So if we're thinking like, I don't want people to judge me, to a degree, that means we're kind of judging ourselves. Absolutely. And so getting in there and like pulling that out and seeing like, people can actually accept me on these terms, and like I can accept myself.
I so appreciate what you're saying, because what I'm hearing you say repeatedly is notice that discomfort and lean into it. Mm-hmm. What I hear from people is their criticism of therapy is people come in and they say, I've got anxiety, I've got depression, and they conclude, what can I do? I got this diagnosis, and if people critique psychotherapy and say, people never change. They just hide behind their label, so to speak, and it's their get out of jail, not be responsible or accountable for anything. And I really like what you're saying is we want people to know, lean into that discomfort. I think Freud said it well. We avoid pain and we seek pleasure. And that's part of the human condition. You're saying, just notice this. Don't judge yourself, but notice that discomfort. Don't judge yourself for having it. And with curiosity, lean into it. And group, as we're talking, affords lots of opportunities to just notice the discomfort and lean into it rather than avoid it. Yeah. And I just want to say, because I know you're going to bring this up too, Isaac, because I probably cut you off. You were going to say to the listeners, remember the episode we did on vulnerability.
Oh, yeah. I actually have listened to the entire series 8 times back to back.
As far as everybody knows, you've done that. And we have talked about this really important topic of vulnerability. It's one of our first podcasts that we did, and the benefits of vulnerability. It's really worth listening to if you're thinking about doing group.
Yeah. I was going to just add on to what you were saying about kind of having a chance to address things that make you uncomfortable. So imagine if you have social anxiety. Like, let's say the primary thing that brings you into individual therapy is social anxiety. So the thought of going to group therapy is probably going to be at the bottom of your list of things that you want to try to address this. However, would you rather move? So again, in the spirit of like moving towards your fear, is like your individual therapist might prescribe you and say like, I want you to go and try to go to some event out in, go to like a, open mic night or go to a book club or something and try to meet people and talk to people. Would you rather do that like completely on your own? Or would you rather go to a kind of a contained situation, maybe even with your own therapist? Because sometimes the individual therapist, is the group leader. But why don't you practice in a space that's confidential, that's an hour versus like, I'm just off on my own somewhere, where you might shut down.
Might really be exposed.
Yeah. Right. Like, so again, I think it is, even though it's probably extremely uncomfortable, you are facing a fear in a more contained situation. And one other point I wanted to bring up, I wanted to make sure I mentioned another benefit was helping other people. So you had talked about having the experience of having others accept you when you're vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So I think another benefit of it is you get to be the helper for others. So in individual therapy, that's not what's happening. You're not helping your therapist in the process. You might be and not know it, but like it's not a two-way conversation typically about like both of your issues. Well, it shouldn't be. But in a group, you're getting that positive experience of, I have something to offer, right? Like if you know how to address something, like, hey, I actually helped this other person. I wasn't planning to do that, and that actually is a brain chemistry thing.
that was what I was thinking of earlier, something along those lines when you had mentioned community. Within community, there's a sense of purpose. And I think that's a huge benefit to people when they're struggling or feeling kind of out to sea in their emotions, right? Like finding something that can drive you. And the group is obviously not going to be your purpose in life, but it's at least a stepping stone to say like, oh, I can show up and I belong somewhere and have,
Ooh, that's a big word, belong. I have a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Right.
And to your point, I have a sense of contributing. I can contribute.
Contributing, exactly.
Yes.
Which I think it boosts self-esteem, pretty sure.
I know it does for me.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So I want to
go ahead.
I wanted to ask too. So let's say there's someone listening to this podcast and they're thinking like, all right, I may be interested in group therapy. How the heck do I get started? Like, what do I do? Right. And so Isaac has a group starting up in a couple of weeks, I believe.
Yep. It's open enrollment, so people can kind of hop in.
Perfect.
So it's usually there's some people that drop out in the beginning, which is pretty typical.
Sure. But it's going to be an ongoing enrollment, meaning even in like a month from now, if you hear this, you can still inquire about it, right?
Yeah, you can ask about it.
Yep.
I think just calling the Nystrom main line and asking for Isaac in Apple Valley. You want to join his group.
You're the only Isaac in Apple Valley.
I think there's another one.
Can I give the number? I've always wanted to do this.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So if you are
moment,
interested,
Brett.
this is exciting for me. So if you are interested, what's the group about, first of all?
It's very much just kind of what we've been talking about, this sort of model of like here and now processing, working on interpersonal relationships, process some mental health stuff like anxiety, depression, what have you. It's just kind of got to go where the wind takes us, I think, in it. Especially, it's going to be such a mixed bag of people. And so it's hard to say where it's going to go.
What's the outcome you're hoping for?
It's going to be different for every person. Depends what they come in there looking for. Is it just how to relate to people? Is it, am I alone in this? Finding my sense of purpose or drive. Yeah, so it's really going to be
addressing many of the kind of core human challenges.
Yeah.
Really. I know you've got, did you study philosophy?
I do have my second major was philosophy.
Yeah, okay. Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
So, philosophers.
Oh, wow.
Guys,
Look at
this
us. This is very exciting.
I was going to just say, oh, yes.
This
absolutely.
is like a group right here.
Brett, you have to grow a mustache.
Yeah.
I can't, but I would if I could.
We'll just buy you one.
Okay. Yes.
Well, we're all tempted to get into deep philosophical issues, but your group really does address some of those core human issues that we have, that we all struggle with, that seem sort of taken for granted, that are given. Like, how do I relate to people? This is hard. It's incredibly hard because we do live in a very individualistic culture. So a lot of benefits for people here. And again, it's going to be open at any time. So I want to give the phone number. I'm kind of excited.
Do it.
So if you want to enjoy Isaac more, as we've been enjoying him here today, the mental health hipster. So you can call this number here. It's 952-997-3020. Once again, that's 952-997-3020. I've always
You have
wanted
the best
to
infomercial voice.
I know. I practice at drive-thrus. So
it's awesome.
Thanks. I've always wanted to do that. And
so I think too, this is going to be a long-term group, right? Like, so the other thing,
I don't have an end date.
Right. So people might be wondering, okay, what if I start in like 2 months from now? Am I going to be missing half of it? Right. It's supposed to be ongoing as long as it can.
Yeah, and I think adding new members as like maybe some members are leaving. There's like the kind of seniority, kind of greenhorn dynamic where you're learning off of each other, and you can also like the person who's been there can look back and be like, oh wow, I have made progress,
right?
And then also seeing like, oh, I can make progress,
and hopefully it'll be a group maybe that expands into other groups because this is such a universal human experience that you're addressing.
Yeah.
What if someone's thinking like, well, I've never even been to individual therapy. I don't have a diagnosis. Like I don't, but I know that I've been wanting something like this. So when they reach out to the number that was so beautifully read by Brett,
Thank you.
what happens? Do they get scheduled with you for an intake?
Yeah, generally I'll want to meet them at least once.
Okay.
Depending when they're trying to join, I'll meet them once, and if they're like, I can't join until 3 months from now, then probably meet again and kind of rehash like what the group's going to be about. And everything.
So you'd want to get to know them and kind of...
Yeah, spend at least 1 or 2 sessions. And then throughout the group, you know, I'll meet with people individually, maybe on like a month and a half basis and check in, like, what are you thinking? Where's your head at with all this? So,
Great. Yeah. Okay, so they wouldn't necessarily call up and just be like thrown into the group first day. They have you, they want to, like, you'd make a connection first.
Yes. And we'd kind of figure out goals.
Nice.
And so, you know, whatever they share in an individual session, it's going to be in the back of my mind in the group. But my job isn't to kind of call people out. Well, remember you said you were going to do this.
Oh, good. That's
I want
a good
them
point.
to have the kind of gusto to say it on their own in the group, right? And that's going to be a skill to work on as well.
So you're not going to be like, this is Joe and he's diagnosed with this, and this.
Right. We're not just calling things out. We're going to sit there and, you know,
people can share if they want.
Can play a game the first day or something. You know, let the guard down and kind of lay some ground rules and things like that. So.
Okay. I know another big thing always on our minds is, how is this paid for? Right?
Yeah, insurance covers it.
Okay, like most insurance plans,
to my knowledge,
have coverage. Okay.
Yeah, you know, I'm not hip on the insurance side of things. Well, there's a reason I'm a therapist.
Well, and I think that's a challenge for all therapists, because there's so many different plans, there's so many different, you know, coverages. So I always encourage people, call up your insurance company if you are interested in pursuing this, and you don't necessarily have to do it before meeting with Isaac, but it would be a help, I think, to just know, you know, does my plan cover group psychotherapy? So, yeah, that would be a good thing to do.
Isaac, we're so glad you came here today to shed light on this really important, and as you highlighted too, Christa, this very effective way of seeing change in our lives. And I really like what you said earlier, Christa, you know, moving towards the things that we're fearful about.
Yep.
And that really takes courage. I think of being in a haunted house, you know, where they have that all dark black section and you're sort of moving forward, kind of groping the walls, and you're worried something's... I mean, that takes a lot of courage.
Sure does.
It does. And shout out to... I'll be honest, I see a lot of women coming for therapy, and it takes courage. And so just a challenge to the men. A lot of times it's like, oh, we're talking about feelings, and I'm not wired for that. I think men are wired for courage just like women are.
Absolutely.
That is something on my docket with one of my coworkers. We had talked about starting a men's group as well.
I love it. So, yeah, we're going to be talking in the near future about what it means to be man and masculine, so you want to be looking forward to that. But I just really want to challenge men to pursue therapy, whether it's individual or group.
Yep.
And it's not... unmanly in any way. It does take courage and to lean into that. So I just want to do a little commercial for that.
Yeah, take it from a guy with a mustache.
Right. Yeah.
And we'll see if you're sporting the mustache, you know, if people join the group, you know, they'll have to.
I mean, if no other reason to go to group, right?
Yes, you got to check out this mustache.
Exactly.
Okay, everyone. So Isaac Hatch-Gillette is the name, and he is a therapist out of our Apple Valley location. Brett read the number earlier. We will also post it with the episode notes. Anybody have any closing remarks before we wrap up for today?
It was just good to be here with you guys. It was actually a lot of fun.
We're going to have to talk philosophy at some point.
Absolutely.
Maybe bore our listeners with
William James.
Okay.
Philosopher, psychologist.
Yeah, absolutely. We could do the philosophy of psychology and see our listenership really shrink down. So it is expanding, and we're glad. We're so appreciative of people who have been joining. And please spread the word about Psych for Psychology.
Yes.
We want to make it more normalized and approachable for people.
Yep. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.